love is action. It's action that's good for you and good for other people. And it's transformative. And I think it's like what is at the foundation of liberation. I think the opposite of love is indifference.
You have to love people to get this work done. Movement work is understanding platonic love. I think before I really got into movement work, I had understood love of my family. When I got into the movement work, I'd never really been in spaces where I felt held by Black women and girls. When I became an organizer, it was like I was automatically just accepted into this world with other Black girls, with other Black women who kind of just wrapped their arms around me and said, we're going to take you in, we're going to mentor you. And this was people from all around the country who didn't know me. These were so many different things that I didn't have before. And I think that's been what's propelling me through organizing, through this movement. I think that's also what's keeping me in this, and that's helping me stay afloat and not really get burnt out like we see people typically do these days.
I learned a lot of lessons from the queer folks around me. I learned a lot of lessons from the Black folks around me. There weren't a lot of queer Black folks around me in Ohio, in my parts of Ohio, for me to learn from. Not that they're not there. I just didn't find them until my late teens. And so I learned a lot from the older lesbians, queer folks who are gender expansive but might label it a little differently because of the time periods that they came up in the 70s and even the 60s, who participated in SAGE programming in Cleveland area. I learned a lot about how allyship works when it comes to cross movement organizing. A lot of queer folks who continue to show up for Black folks in Cleveland, in the Ohio area in general. I learned a lot from Black folks about how to create your own spaces, about how to show up for each other when whatever systems and structures that are in place aren't showing up for you. And separately, I kind of took all of the different lessons that I learned from different caring adults in my lives, and that kind of shaped my politics. As I grew up and found people who kind of embodied the intersections of my identity more specifically, whether that be Black non-binary folks, whether that be other queer Black folks who are also Nigerian, also West African. Later, I find out that, yeah, our politics have all kind of like shown up in the same place. But for me, I didn't have those models that looked exactly like me to shape my politics on. I kind of cherry picked the things that made sense for me from the different communities that I was around, and they all kind of converged into the way that I saw the world.
Love is like the will to extend yourself for another person's growth. And yeah, I think that's what it is. I think like love is what drives us to make another person's life or our own, your life better, right? Your spirit more full, your cup more full. Like I think it is an impactful thing. And then in the Darnell Moore article, Black Radical Love, he's talking about how after I think it's the Michael Brown protest, everybody, or the Michael Brown murder, how everybody was like eyes on the protests and that sort of stuff, but they weren't talking about the community building going on, right? Like they weren't talking about the mutual aid, the showing up for each other, the radicalizing each other, the having discussions together, like that love, that stuff that was nourishing people's minds, their hearts, their souls. And so I think I think love it's a very powerful thing. And I think that's why like leading powers are okay with it being stripped, right? Because then it loses its power. Like you say you love me, but you don't think you need to put any actions in to align with that, right? And governments, I don't think they use the words love, but I think it should be assumed that you love your country, you love your constituents, right? But you allow them to go hungry, you allow them to be houseless, you allow them to not have education.
I grew up in a household where there's this idea that if you don't open your mouth, you won't get fed. And so I mean that in a way that you were taught to advocate for yourself. My mom is an unapologetically Black educator who was educated at a historically Black college. And so she always taught me that the education that I receive at school might not reflect me, but it's still my own prerogative to make sure that I learn about my history. And a lot of that history has to do with organizing and advocacy and making sure that you and your communities have what y'all need to survive and to be successful.
When I was growing up, she was like my mom. Of course, there's like that eldest daughter thing, especially we see it all of the time in Black communities and the toll that takes on the eldest daughter. But one thing I appreciate with my sister so much is that she taught me how to have a voice. My sister, she always stood up for herself, even if it was just girls in the school. Even if she was fighting, she always stood up for herself. And I wasn't really like that as a kid. I let people walk all over me. And when I got older, I started to look to my sister more, and I was like, okay, she doesn't take anybody's shit. Basically, she doesn't care who you are. She's going to say something, even if she's talking against the teacher. If you did something wrong, she's going to call you out. And she was all about accountability. That was one thing I heard even when I was younger. Accountability, even if I didn't know what it was, I heard it a lot from her. Hold people accountable. Don't let people walk all over you. You know, you don't deserve to get treated this way. And that was a part of the lesson that I started to bring into this work.
My mom was like that, the type to like give her last 20, right? Or I remember one time she told this story of like there were these like Black kids like in the bus like being loud and rowdy, and like people like to look at them funny and da da da. And one of them said they're hungry, and my mom gave them $5 like, hey, go get a snack or da da da. Like I feel like that's just who she was just always a giver. And so for me, I think that's probably why when people say like, oh, I want to wait until I'm rich to have an impact, or I just need to focus on myself before I can, like, resonates with me, because I'm like, you can have nothing. And granted, she didn't have nothing, but you can have nothing in the capitalist sense and still have a lot to give, right? If as long as you have time and energy, I think there's capacity for you to love.
I think I've always kind of been an advocate since I was young. I've always kind of had a voice. It was never really a stand up for yourself, defend yourself voice. It was more so center people in your life. Always have people really be community oriented. My parents are really, really community oriented when I was growing up. Even now, we always had people in our house. People were always coming, aunts, uncles, people who were aunts or uncles, but not biologically, but coming to just stay with us while they transitioned their life into America and just things like that. So I've always kind of had exposure to that. But when I was in high school, my sister started doing a lot of environmental justice work. And that was kind of like a little in for me to kind of start seeing the system as it really is. But I wasn't there yet. So when I was in like 10th grade during COVID, I was seeing all of the outrage for George Floyd, and I had previously seen all of that outrage for Breonna Taylor, but it was only on social media. And I was like, okay, so why is it that when this Black woman dies and she's murdered, we keep our outrage to social media, we minimize our outrage to just words on a platform instead of actually taking action? And that was basically my call to the movement work. It was, I want to be able to bring Black women, Black girls into spaces where we are not heard of, into spaces where our stories, our voices are never even thought of. So that was really just how I kind of got into the work. I think it's always really been my destiny to get into the work.
Probably officially it started when I was like 15 in high school. I had gotten the opportunity through Prep for Prep, which is a very rigorous scholarship program in New York, to attend a private school, an elite one called Probably Prep. And while I was there, one of my peers and I, Latoya, recognized just kind of like the disconnect / the disparities that existed between our public school, that the public schools we came from and where we were. So we organized a bunch of other of our high school peers to start off with like a mentorship and training program in our local neighborhood. So I would say that's kind of where it started, like mentorship, youth, mentoring youth, kind of radicalizing the youth. And today, that is kind of like that plus at Roastone Concrete, we are aiming to still radicalize youth, but also add in that mutual aid, making sure like basic needs are met while we're doing that like higher level work too.
I, like many queer Black folks who came into themselves in the joyous space that is middle and high school, I fell into community organizing because the spaces that I was frequenting were not set up for me to succeed. They weren't set up for me to exist, let alone succeed. And so by nature of me coming into myself and making space for who I was, advocacy just happened to be a natural byproduct of that. By creating spaces that allowed for me to exist and then thrive, they just so happened to also be spaces for other folks to thrive in the times that followed.
I did a lot of like protesting for Black women and girls. That was kind of it. Then in July, I heard about this young lady's case, Grace. She was a 15-year-old Black girl who was detained in Pontiac, Michigan for not completing her homework. And I was really upset. And once again, this was like a month after I had just got into organizing. Like, not even I just got into organizing. I still didn't really know what organizing was in July of 2020. I was just like, I just planned this protest. I can do it. And it was kind of like that. And when I heard about Grace's case, I was like, okay, I can do this. So did Grace's case. We did an overnight rally. We did a sit out, things like that. Following that, I kind of dived into healing work. So I started doing healing work for Black girls. Then during that fall, then it was like, okay, COVID, and I go to Detroit Public Schools Community District, where they dropped the ball on COVID and our education was completely ruined because of it. So then I started really battling my district, battling how they were policing us online, how they were still putting so much funding into our police department, despite the fact that we were completely virtual. Things like that. I've done a lot of like consulting for grant making to help bring Black women and girls into spaces for grant makers, and how do we properly assess that. I do a lot of work now currently for push out and to end push out, and to really bring more attention and to educate people on the criminalization of Black girls, because I think that a lot of people don't understand how Black girls specifically fit into the school to prison pipeline and how that affects us. I think we're definitely a group that's already been erased from a lot of research, from a lot of history, despite us literally always being at the forefront of everything.
All of my organizing and activism is centered in a Black queer feminist lens. And so I focus on Black and brown trans youth. And youth kind of has expanded the older that I get, and understand that 22 is a lot younger than I thought it was when I was 15. And so like my experiences as they exist in the moment definitely shape the forefront of my advocacy. So the work that I was doing for youth when I was 15 is a lot different than the advocacy that I'm doing for young people now that I'm 22. But the general spirit of advocating for Black and brown queer young folks, however that may seem, that's kind of where I sit.
I think I do a lot of advocacy work, and not necessarily in a political setting or space, but I think everywhere that I am, we're going to talk about mutual aid. We're going to talk about socialism. We're going to talk about who's being excluded from these spaces. So when I was at Poly, the private school that I was at, that's when I was really like having these debates with people about capitalism versus socialism and You know, I think I like to radicalize people. And so when I was in high school, it was my very own friends who I was having those debates with. And now I would like to say that I feel like I've swayed them to the winning team. But I think even in organizations that I enter, right? So and classes that I take, and you know, all of these like elite often white spaces that I'm able to enter. I think that's kind of the work that I do. I try to bring in the voices of like my community and people, and my own voice, right? My own experience, to, I think, once again, elevate the work that we're doing to be more justice work.
I think that sacrifice is such a good word because when it comes time for liberation, um, especially, and I want to say especially now, but that's hard because like I'm young and coming up right now. When people were young and coming up in the 60s, they also probably said, especially now more than ever, like this is the time when it matters so much more than the other times. And in the 20s, people were probably like coming up 25, like especially now more than ever, like this is the time. So like when you're young and things are bad, it always feels pressing and it always feels so immediate. And so part of that is because things might feel super pressing to certain communities, like in those split seconds, I think that folks feel more willing to sacrifice others in the course of like putting their own freedoms, like securing their own freedoms. And like for me, I think one of the things that I look back to is like 2016 when we got marriage equality. I saw a lot of folks who were like, this is the, especially now, like it's really important that this is what we do. And trans folks were kind of like, okay, but like, what about us? And now we sit here in 2023 and like, it's is not good. And like, could things have been different in 2016? Probably. How? I don't know. I was 16 years old. But now I'm not 16 anymore. And so I have to think critically about like the conversations we're having about like protecting trans folks. So when I see like a lot of folks who are not organizing from a Black queer feminist lens, and they are specifically trying to protect like mostly otherwise privileged white trans people, for example, and I'm like, ooh, like, yes, it is not good for them right now. But also like folks who have other minoritized identities, like it's continuously been not good for them in other ways. And now they're also being attacked for their trans identity. They probably were before too, but now we're just talking about it in the mainstream news. And so like, what sacrifices do I specifically see Black and brown non-binary folks being forced to make? I see them being forced to put the conversation about racial discrimination and their racial identities to the side to particularly talk about trans issues that will also benefit white people. And for me, like, that's incredibly frustrating because it's like, ooh, okay, like, let's say we do that. Let's say we compartmentalize and silo our identities in ways that do not work, in ways that we cannot actually do, to protect only white trans people. Let's say we do that and then they're protected. What's the fight going to be in 2027? Like, we're going to have a very similar conversation that we did about marriage equality in 2016. And so I think it's really difficult because when things are bad and there's an opportunity for small change, there are a lot of people who would benefit from that small change who are willing to put everybody else's needs on the back burner. And so I think that for us, like for people who sit at the margins, at the intersections, it's hard because we have to figure out like, what sacrifices are we gonna have to make for the collective, and where do we put our foot down and say this is where the collective needs to show up for us? And then who's making those decisions? It's not 22-year-olds like me, but is it? Who's to say? Sometimes it is. And so I think that's the sacrifice, is like, when do you decide that you are who needs to be protected?
So, like I said, I went through this phenomenal scholarship program, transferred to this elite private school, was like excelling, thriving, you know. I feel like doing what they said we should do, right? Like, you continue to enter these rooms and sit at these tables and get into these spaces, and then everything's going to be okay, right? But when simultaneously I'm going to school doing all of this stuff, but I'm going home. My mom is an undocumented immigrant from Jamaica who had kidney stones that escalated to kidney. Couldn't get a transplant because you know, like, her documentation status didn't allow her certain levels of healthcare and all this other stuff. And then when I was a junior in high school, she passed away. And for me, it was like, of course, a lot of thoughts, feelings, emotions. Some lasting ones include like I was doing what they said we should do, right? Like I was following the recipe, like doing the formula, whatever, and it didn't work, right? And so for me, it was like, and I felt like I even was prioritizing school and homework and work and everything over my family, right? Because it felt like that was what I was supposed to be doing. But then it was like, I got to this point of recognizing like I'm doing all of this here and it's not doing anything for, you feel me, to like really shift power dynamics, to change the world for real. And so yeah, um I I think I continued to do things like that even after. So she passed away when I was a junior in high school. I ended up applying and getting into Stanford. But I think while I was there, um, I kind of got to this point of like, yeah, no, I don't have to always keep going to you guys' tables because you guys aren't talking about this stuff for real, right? Like you don't actually want to change it. You don't want all of us at your table. You might take one or two or three or four of us, but you don't want, you know what I'm saying? And so recognizing, yeah, like my issues will not be solved in those areas. And so I think when it comes to like career choice, I like did an internship at a bank because once again they say like when you want to make change, like you need to understand like how these systems work, how money works, da 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 da. And I went to that bank for a summer. I'm like, no, like this is not teaching me anything about how to have real change in my community. And so yeah, I think that actually was like the last time of like I kind of stopped joining organizations and stuff like that just to be able to say like, oh, I did this and oh, I entered this space, because I recognize that yeah, like you guys are not about it for real, for lack of better words. Like being at this table is not going to do anything for my people right in the corner over there, right? It's just going to bring one other person into this space.
When we were fighting for our schedule, we the count day period basically is a period where students in the school are counted for, and based off of that, the school gets their funding. So during this period, we were like, we want our schedule changed. We are going to do a strike and tell all of these students not to show up during count day, because once you play with their money, they get scared. So we did that. But some of the people that I wouldn't even call this organizing. Some of the people that was a part of the little group that I was working with did not like that. But the thing is, when you are doing this work, it's within your best interest to not show the people that you're trying to call into the work that there's some division happening within the group. So it was really hard for us to convince people on the outside to join in on the strike once they seen that, oh, but some of y'all are going to class. Why are you telling me not to go to class if you're going to go to class? You know, that was the thing. And that's when I kind of had to realize that if the space isn't benefiting me, I need to leave. If the space isn't listening to me, I was getting called aggressive every day in that space. Everybody was like, oh, you're being aggressive. Oh, we got into so many arguments. I don't even want to relive that. But understanding it's okay to leave. And I realized that table was not servicing me every time, because I realized I kept having to fight. I kept having to fight every day. I felt like I was fighting harder to be included in the space than I was to get the schedule changed. It felt like it was a battle. I was at war with the people I was supposed to be working with, and that's not how this work is supposed to be. So take your step back, leave. And that's really what it was. But we still got the schedule changed. So it can happen. You can still get your change even if that table wasn't serving.
So, okay, like I said, I grew up in Ohio. I went to college in Ohio. And as an unapologetic queer, Black, non-binary person, yeah, I made some sacrifices. And for me, those sacrifices looked like being labeled the angry Black person who isn't willing to fit in with the way that things are going, who's always shaking the table, always making waves, always unsatisfied with what we're currently doing. And for some people, the idea of creating a space that is equitable feels uncomfortable because they're not used to having just enough, but having a little taken away so that other people can also eat. That idea of equality can hurt when you're used to excess, when you're used to supremacy. And so there's a lot of that in the circles where I grew up. And so the sacrifice that I made, was coming off as somebody who could be pleasant, somebody who could be like, and that it sounds silly, but like in your day-to-day as an individual, that idea of like being tolerated, like not having that is a sacrifice. Like being the person who walks into a classroom and everyone's like, oh, you know that they're gonna have something to say, like that's a sacrifice, because it takes away from your own personal peace. It takes away from your ability to be in a space and feel safe and feel comfort and feel like you belong. Like this idea of diversity and inclusion, like you fight for that. And sometimes when you fight for inclusion, you get inclusion, but it's at the expense of your belonging. And so like for me personally, that was a sacrifice that I made. I'm happy with that sacrifice because I'm willing to sacrifice my personal belonging for overall equity, in the hopes that in the future, other folks that look like me will be able to have both. My sacrifice is I didn't get both. I can live with that. I moved to Brooklyn.
When I think of the spaces where I feel like most loved, I would say 8 to 9.5 out of 10 times it's like with Black women. And I think we just feel the burden of responsibility, right? I think like when we talk about love being a liberatory thing, right? And love being, I want the best for you, so I'm going to do X, Y, Z. I feel like we often step into that, like looking around and seeing just the circumstances and recognizing that if we don't stand up for X, Y, Z, others probably won't. And so I think that a way that we could combat this, right, is if like others were to grow, to learn and understand love. Because I'm not saying that Black women shouldn't be giving their time, their energy, their resources, but I think it should be poured back into us.
I want to stop having to be in spaces where it does not service me. I want to stop being in spaces where I feel like I can't fully show up as myself. Because so many times in organizing, I feel like I'm putting on this mask. And the only time I ever feel like I'm not putting on that mask is when I'm in community with Black women, when I'm in community with non-binary folk, when I'm in community with queer folk. So at that point, if we all know that, and if we all know that we don't have a seat at any other table, we could just build our own. We got it. Why not?
For me, I like to call a lot of different places home. I'm a wandering spirit. My heart goes a lot of different places. For some people, I understand that they want one home. And like, sure, you're entitled to that. But I think because like there's so much complexity to my identity, I know that if I have one home, it's gonna be real small. It's gonna be real small. And like I want bountiful and like limitless love, and I don't necessarily need that to come from people who look exactly like me. I would prefer that to come from people who like want me in my entirety, whether or not their experiences match or mirror mine.
At my table, we do it all. Like we're building community and we're building a movement. And so I think to do those things, I think you need to do it all. Like you need to meet needs, you need to learn, you need to talk, you need to have fun, you need to cry, you need therapy. You might need to be therapy for each other.
I try to make sure that like I strive for that 100%, that like truly inclusive community. Like what that looks like, if you ask me, I would probably give you an answer that left somebody out. So like, I'm not gonna do it. But what I am gonna say is like, I know that what my ideal table looks like probably still need some work. And so I try to make sure that there's always an empty seat. Like no matter what table I'm building, I want to make sure that there's always room for growth.
I can't tell you what my ideal table looks like. I think that's something I would have to answer as a collective, and not something I can think of by myself, if that makes sense.
So when I was in undergrad, the place that like was doing a lot of work that I was super tapped into and was like, this is really cool. Like, I want to be a part of their table, which is an Ohio organization, is the Black Queer Intersectional Collective, Be Quick. You might be familiar. I mean, like the collective, you as in the Ohio girlies who are watching this, not you, because you're from Minnesota. But like they're doing really good work that I think is super dope, like organizing from a Black queer feminist lens. In terms of like orgs on the national home, like I know a lot of folks who have found their political home at BYP 100, like, and so that's their table. For me, like I don't know that political home is a thing that like rings true to my personal politics, as in I haven't found one, but if I do, maybe I'll eat those words.
But I say an organization currently embodying my ideal table would probably be GGE. Just because they were the first group that I ever worked with that, one, paid me equitably, and that two, centered my voice, centered me in the work. And I'd never experienced that, even despite going to school in a predominantly Black city, seeing people who look like me every day. That was the only time, I think the first time that I was like, okay, there are spaces for people who look like me. GGE has done a great job, I think, of learning how to put the voices and the stories of young people, and specifically of young Black gender non-conforming queer, they understand what it looks like to make that table. They have made the table for us, I think. And I think a lot of orgs need to take a lot of tips from them. If there's anybody I reference the most in my organizing spaces, it's them. It's GGE. Because I'm saying not only are they paying us the way that we are supposed to be paid for our time, but they listen to us.
Sometimes you could build your own table, and it's just you at that table. It's a table for one. And so I think that sometimes like you need community. And sometimes that community might not be yours, but it is still a community. Like, it's really important to talk about building community, but sometimes your community don't exist. When it does, amazing. And like actively seek that out and search for it and nurture it and grow it, and like take so much joy out of the fact that it is available to you. But when it's not available to you, other tables can be just as valid. They might not be as personally fulfilling, or they might. It depends on a lot of factors that like are very inherently personal. And so I think that like, yeah, it's important to build your own tables. It's important to have your own spaces for community. It's important to make sure that those spaces are nurtured and can thrive. However, I don't know how sustainable it is to only have those tables. I think that it is also important to continue to participate in the system despite it being broken. I think that that's maybe where my politics might diverge from some people who don't see that as a necessary evil. But because I grew up in a space where like sometimes those other tables were all I had, and like I have to think about those kids. I have to think about the people who like might not always see themselves reflected in their immediate community. Like, they still deserve to eat. They still deserve to have people who fight for them, whether or not they look like them, and they need to have the tools to be able to do that.
I'm going to be honest and say I'm on a learning stage too. I'm in a learning journey, because I think I definitely like bounce back and forth between like, the government's not going to do anything for us. Let's just do it on our own. But I think even when I say we should do it on our own, I think it's like with the understanding and assumption that we need to, for ourselves, like figure out what is good, what we want, what we need, what we agree on, and movement builds, and then demand that from the government, right? Because at the end of the day, like when we talk about like the different struggles we're facing, it's because of the governments, right? It's because of the laws they write, right? It's written in there. And so to totally ignore that and disregard that, I think is not the most strategic for us. But I definitely think that we have work to do at our own table, right? I think we have a movement to build. We have a common understanding to arrive to. We have organizing to do before we conform to this whole other table that, once again, their agenda is not about us.
We are trying to take down something that has been alive much longer than we were, that has been alive before all of the things that we see right now were even here. We are taking down an institution. We are taking down decades. We are taking generations of power, and we are destroying that. So that means, for one, we always need each other, because at the end of the day, outside of all of this, outside of if we tore all these buildings down, if we took all these people off these pedestals, we still need each other. We are not going to have anything if we get liberation. But, we say liberation as if it's a thing, but I think Angela Davis said it, but liberation is a journey. And liberation is not just the end goal, but liberation is a journey of things that we are going to do, that we are going to experience, that we are going to live in as we get to our end goal, as we all get to our freedom dreams. I think that's something that we should be mindful of when we create a table, is don't put these expectations on people that only you can uphold. And I think that's something that we do too often. Everybody is dedicated to the movement in a different way. So when you're creating a table, you need to understand that we're not linear. We can't check off boxes and say this person has this person has this. We're all different. So when you are making these tables, understand that you're inviting so many different people to this table to be themselves, and you're inviting them to this table because they didn't have a table before. They didn't have a seat before. So giving people grace, because we will make mistakes, and understanding that, once I said love, but grace is another thing that will keep us going. Understanding that we can't just push people away at the first mistake. And sometimes we might just need to educate people, even though how much we hate educating people sometimes on things that we think they should already know.
One that I'm actively learning is the importance of calling in, and not even calling in, but being open to understanding lessons of the past. I think one thing that's really difficult, especially in specifically queer circles, is making sure that we're making active bonds with our elders. We don't always do that, and it's really hard, because in the past 20 years, hell, even in the past 5 years, language has evolved so much. And so the language that I use to define myself just didn't exist for our elders. And that doesn't make their lived experiences as queer folks any less valid than ours. And I think younger folks, sometimes we don't get that. And whether it's that we are actively choosing not to get that, or ignorance, I think a lot of it is just ignorance. It's difficult for a lot of folks. They don't know queer elders. And so when you meet your first queer elder and they're like, I don't know nothing about this trans stuff that y'all are doing, you might get hit with a little bit of resistance. But what I think is really important for us, and I think is essential to liberation is intergenerational. And so if we don't understand our elders, then how are we going to learn from the battles that they fought? And I think especially when it comes to our queer elders, a whole generation of folks didn't make it. The AIDS crisis happened, and we're still dealing with that. So the folks that did make it, it's so imperative that they are held to the level of I'm not trying to be dramatic about this, but held to the level of icon status that they have earned through living through the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s. And we don't often give them their flowers in that way. We don't learn how to find that middle ground between saying language has evolved. So what I am now, what did that look like in the 70s? If I existed in the 70s, did you have a friend that looked like me? How did they identify? Like, why did they consider themselves a lesbian? Like, what language was available? Like, do you think that any of your friends who are stone tops now, like, would they consider themselves trans? Like, these are all questions in community conversations that we definitely should be having a lot more than we currently do. And like, when you start to have those conversations, you understand some of those old heads are wild. Like, and the politics around it, the organizing tips that you learn, all of that's important, but secondarily so. The idea of like building community intergenerationally so that you're not only creating liberation for the people who are currently fighting for it, but also like for the folks who have already earned it.
I'm just going to stick with this agenda analogy and say, when creating a table, younger generations, young people, anyone doing the work should set an agenda that is adaptable. So set the agenda as in be organized, right? Like, don't just think we can come here and sit and whatever happens, but like, let's have a direction and let's have a movement. And even if you don't know specifically what that direction is going to be, like, you should know that. You should know that you don't know the direction, and do that work to create it, co-create it. And make sure it's in line with history and your principles and your learnings and that sort of stuff. So set the agenda for sure. Don't let it be a free-for-all. So I would say that, and I would say let it be open and adaptable, right? Like, you need to be humble and recognize that while what you know is valuable, you don't know everything. And so allow people to co-create with you. Because we're stronger together, right? Like, it's about movement building. And so allow people to bring the issues that matters to them, especially if like it's a potential comrade, like, let the work be reflective of their needs and stuff as well, as long as it's in line with larger principles. But I would say don't recreate the spirit of exclusivity and whatever else it is, that otherization that we find at tables we're being excluded from.
It is so important for Black LGBTQ plus and non-binary folks to create our own tables, because the thing is, we are our own best advocates. We advocate for ourselves the best, and we've already seen so many times where we have not been invited to the table. So quite frankly, forget their table. Let's make our own. Even if we got to build the legs, we got to build the tabletop. I do think it's really important. I might say that's the only way we'll actually get liberation. We really need to understand that there will never be any liberation for us if we do not value community. Love is a magical thing, and Black love is a magical thing, and there is so much power and so much that you can get done if you just love. If we love on each other, and if we hold each other, and if we always center each other. Yeah.